Stamp Artiste writes, I drool over colour combinations that I see on websites, such as my personal favourite, Design Seeds. I am so inspired by these colour combinations and would love to use them in my scrapping, but I'm at a loss as to how to go about doing this. I like to start with at least one pattern paper and work from there, but pattern papers rarely contain these specific colour combinations. Glitter Girl, can you help Stamp Artiste colour her way to crowning combinations?
Of course I can. We're continuing this week with this mini-series of wedding scrapbooking tips, but I promise that today's adventure is still going to be useful even if you're not scrapbooking a wedding, so I hope you will carry on watching and have a look at my advice for how I use a color palette like this one. Now, the discussion on the message board was specifically about these color palettes produced by a website called Design Seeds, where they take one photo and then break it down into the colors that make that beautiful image. So on the inspiration board, the mood board, for this particular wedding album, I pinned two different Design Seeds color schemes. They both use the pinks and the green that were present in the wedding colors, but they also have some difference in the neutrals. So this is the one that I'm using for the majority of the wedding photos, and it includes for neutrals a very pale cream, a medium craft type tone or a tan, and a dark brown. So I'm adding these shades of pink and this hit of green in with those neutrals. Now I'm using a different color scheme with photos that are just of the bride because I think the dark brown is a little bit too heavy for that lovely light bridal type photo, and that I'm using shades of softer gray. But today I'm going to stick with this one because I'm using these two photos, which are darker and where you have all the scenery behind, and include more than just the bride, of course. So my process like this, these colors do help me to create a mix of pattern papers, and I've already gone through and shown you all the different papers I put in the box to work on this album. But I specifically want to show you then how I go from that big set of papers into what goes into one particular layout and the way that this can be helpful for your process. So I have two things that I've decided on already for today's page. I'm going to be using this craft chevron for the background. This is from My Mind's Eye, Find Your Wings and Fly. The other side is gorgeous as well, but it doesn't really fit with the style of this particular album, and I wanted this simpler design for the background. And then I've matted the two 4x6 photos of the bride side and the groom side with a pink polka dot from an older Pebbles collection. Okay, so I know that I have those two things present, and you can see that those two colors already come from this color scheme. I have the kind of tan or craft color here, and I have that lighter, warmer pink. So from here, I'm looking at the other elements that I can include and how much of each will be useful on this layout to keep things balanced. Well, the color that's boldest is always the color that's going to catch your eye the most. And if you even look at the photograph that they've included, this amount of space in the photo that's held by the dark brown color is very small, and yet it still grabs your attention. And in fact, being the center of the flower is something that's anchoring all those other layers, the layers created of the petal and everything else. It's holding together the design of the flower, as it were. So you don't need a lot of the darkest or boldest color. I only need a little bit. So I tend to bring in a little bit of that darker tone in a solid color because I don't have a lot of dark brown pattern papers, but I do have some brown cardstock. And it might be as simple as just creating a little partial mat or anchoring with a strip of this particular paper or something like that, but I won't even need this full amount. That just happens to be the size that it's cut to at the moment. And then I'm looking for some other shades of pink and a little bit of this green to match the tiny bit of green that you can see in the photos. So when I have my big stack of paper that I'd chosen for this full album, I have lots of options even though I'm not choosing from my entire collection of papers, and it's the process I need to go through and figure out what will be most useful for this page. Well, one thing I like to include is something that might go around the outside. Now, one way to include your darker color is to have that be the 12 by 12 sheet and cut this paper down just a little bit and have that darker edge of cardstock around the outside. But one thing that I really like, I love this look, but I lately like even more the idea of having a pattern that has a bolder color behind this one. So I don't want something that's going to be even in tone or saturation with this paper, because what I'm imagining is that I'll just trim off a 1/4 inch on each side and put it on another pattern paper. So if it happens to be a pattern that has the same sort of saturation, say I used something that's white based like this and I put this pattern next to it, I'm not going to get much impact. It's almost going to look like the two papers were just stacked up rather than purposely chosen and placed around the edge. Likewise, if I use something that has a really big pattern, it won't read very well at the side of the page. So if I take this larger pattern, for example, and I cover up almost all of it, you're not going to be able to tell that that was a floral or anything like that. So for something that's going to go around the outside edge, I need a small pattern that's going to repeat so that I know what it is. So something like a polka dot or a chevron can work, but because I've chosen a chevron here, probably best to steer clear of that. And something that has more color to it rather than being this same sort of mix with white. So if you can imagine the reverse of this paper, if you could swap the green and the white, then this would be a great choice. But this one is heavier on the color, so there's more green. This is getting better because I have more contrast, but it's still not perfect. I'd really like to have something that has a bit more color. Now, what about this really bold polka dot? It's quite a large polka dot, but if I place these two together, you can start to see what I mean, that this will look like a frame, and because the pattern is small enough and it repeats, you'll be able to tell what it is. But I think in this particular case, that pink isn't the best choice to go with this warm pink. So I'll save that for another layout. And I'm wondering about something, how about a green spotted pattern, something really small. So if I add this around the outside edge, you'll definitely be able to see what that pattern is. It has enough contrast because this has almost all green with a little bit of white rather than being all white or all that kind of in-between tone like a craft cardstock where it's not a light color, it's not a dark color, it's right there in the middle. This has more saturation, so I can see the contrast between the green and the craft background here. So that's a useful one if I'm going to go ahead and add a frame around the outside. And again, I'm looking at one of the colors that is in the middle of the range here. It's not my darkest color, it's not my lightest color, it's something that's nice in the middle and provides a bit of contrast, like there's just the one bit of green while there's all of these other tones. Now I'm starting to have most of the colors in the color scheme here represented on my layout, but I don't have quite all of them, and there's nothing left in my stack of papers that makes a particularly good match to represent this idea, the mix of more than one shade of pink. I have plenty of pinks in there, it's just that none of them are grabbing my eye straight away as something else that's a really nice match to this particular pink that I've already chosen in another level of saturation. So sometimes it's best to look at something that's not a paper and look at the other items in your stash, like ink pads, or in this case, I'm going to try some work with mist to create some different looks. Now, what I want to do is create something that will include more than one shade of pink. So I'm starting with just one shade of pink Mr. Huey and a watercolor brush. One thing that I like to do with a color scheme and a layout is make a link in my mind about whether the colors for a layout are chosen because they're really bold or because they're very delicate. In this case, the color scheme I'm using for this wedding is quite delicate, and you can see that continuing through the design of my pages, where I'm using a lot more open space and a lot of small layers, and perhaps more so than some of my other layouts. So for this, I'm using just something that, well, it's not particularly a pattern paper, it's actually an envelope. What I was looking for was a white or cream bit of paper with a nice texture to it. And watercolor paper would be perfect here, but I just didn't have any to hand, and I did have plenty of these envelopes. So I'm going to give that a try, even though I'm going to cut it into pieces that won't be envelopes anymore when I'm done with them. And I'm using a watercolor brush to get some of the mist, and with some watercolor brushes you can use them directly from the bottle, and others, because of the different sizes of both the bottle and the brush, you'll need something else to separate things. You can also water down the mist color in the brush, because you can add your water to the brush or to the mix that you're using, so that you can have different shades all within the same color. That way you'll get this range of different saturations, but you'll know that all the colors will match. So here I have a little bit of water, and I can just add some mist to that, and as I go, if I want the color to be bolder, I can just add more. So then all I want to do is go back and forth, creating a little painted swatch. So that I pick up the color on the textured paper. Then I can also do a bit that's not diluted at all, so I get the color as it comes straight from the bottle. And you can see the difference here in the different colors. So then I can just keep doing the same thing, but adding different amounts of water, letting them dry, see how the colors go. And what I really want to create here is about 6 boxes of these little faded pink squares, so that I have a variety of different colors, or well, not colors, they're all the same color, but different shades represented. So I have some that are darker than the others. Really, really simple. And if something seems a bit too dark, you can come back and add more water to it. If it seems too light, you can add the concentrated bit. Really, really simple. And I'm only using a little bit of mist, just a couple sprays of mist here, so I could get lots from this without having to use much of my Mr. Huey at all. In terms of mist being either delicate or bold, something like this where the color is watered down and is very soft or faded certainly falls under the delicate category, but I also think that the smaller drops can also work with the delicate look, even if they're in a high contrasting color, so you get a darker shade. So this time, to go along with the pale pinks, I brought in a little bit of dark brown Mr. Huey, and I think there are different techniques that will make mist either bold or delicate. So if you wanted to go bold with your mist, use it by spraying it directly on the page, or spray it really close to the page and let it pour down the page. You'll get really saturated color and you'll get a very bold statement. But if you want to spray it over an expanse that's going to have more of a softer mist about it, you can use a mask and spray from a distance and get a softer feel. So I'm just going to place this giant mask over this. Now, this is all because I can just wipe the mist off my table, but if you wanted to do it in a box to keep from making a mess, that would probably be advisable. And I'm just going to spray from quite far away so that I get smaller droplets, and I'm not going to do too much. I don't want to cover up all of that area. I just want this soft little asterisk type design. And because I haven't let this dry completely, you can see where some of the paper is still a bit wet, and it will make the color run, and I'm totally okay with that. I wanted it to be sort of an in-between stage, so you'll see that most of it is dry and gives me tiny little dots, but some of it watercolors out for that effect. Although this looks lovely as an interesting little piece of art all on its own, and I'm a little bit tempted to just write someone's address and put a card in it and pop it in the post, I am going to cut this up to create embellishments for my page. So I'm going to cut each of these into a little rectangle and add some brown ink around the edges. Now I have all these little pieces dried and cut into rectangles. I ended up cutting them so they are 1.5 inches by 2 inches, and I can piece together the layout with all these different parts that I have that represent all my colors. So I'll start with the background, and I have the craft cardstock well, it's not cardstock, I keep saying that, it's pattern paper, but in the craft tone, and that's trimmed to just smaller than the 12 by 12 so that that green polka dot will show around the edge. And there's just a bit of brown ink around the edge of this, and I can also add a little bit more detail to the edges here with some stamps and bring in my color. Now, one option you can do is to stamp that before you've adhered the paper, but obviously I didn't do that. And another is to stamp on this, but then make sure that if you just want to stamp on this paper, you're covering up the green. So it's as easy as taking a Post-it note and placing it over the spot that you don't want to stamp. That's called a masking, and there's lots of more intricate ways you can use that technique in your stamping to do multiple layers with one particular stamp and things like that. But I just want to cover up the green to make it a little easier and cleaner to stamp a little bit of floral here. So I'm using the same stamps that I've been using throughout this album, this floral with the pink ink. And that again is in my color scheme. And I just want this to run off the edge of the page up here. And then I'm going to layer a little bit of brown ink on top of this as well. So I'll leave the Post-it note intact and just stamp off the excess ink there. And where I've used a lighter tone from the color scheme, I then want to bring in something with a bit more contrast, because I've just stamped a relatively light color onto another light color. So I'm just using pale colors there. If I want to give it a little bit more weight on the page, I need to bring in a darker or more concentrated shade. So for that, I'm going to bring in the brown from the color scheme, and with the dark brown, I'm going to be going with something that's smaller than the larger, paler piece. So just going to stamp this little circle with the point so that it goes off the page. And this is also handy because you have the Post-it note there ready to just check that the stamp is going to stamp the way you imagine it, in case there's any uneven spot or anything that you need to check to make sure you're going to get a clean impression. So what I want is for the circle to go off the top of the page here, but not the hand. And I can stamp off the extra, and then I can continue to add in more stamping within my color scheme there. I can even bring in a light brown to add a little bit more in between. And where I have a circle shape here and quite an abstract shape here, it would be nice to bring in something that's a horizontal element. I do have this look up arrow here, and I also have these arrows, or this little detailed one that I've used on an earlier layout. The date could also be a horizontal type element, because I could pair it with either writing the date or stamping the date with a date stamp. So I think that might be a good element to add up here at the top and bring in some of the other shades and colors in my color. To bring in a little bit of the green from the color scheme, I'm going to use a stamp that I used before with the text and then the filigree underneath, but I'm going to line it up so that the text won't show on this page. I just want the filigree to show, and that's going to overlap some of this with a little bit of green, just to bring in all those different elements of the color scheme without having a lot of page filled up. So even within this tiny little space, I've got most of the colors in my color scheme represented already. Now, this is a very similar composition to something you've already seen me use with a single 5x7. So I'm placing my photos in the bottom 2/3 of the page, and I have this wide photo mat that gives me a pocket over here, and because I've started the stamping up here, I'm looking at an L shape once I fill in this space. So I now have my little misted and watercolored pieces that I made earlier, and I can arrange them back together so that you can see the starburst shape there. And I'm going to work with these as a little embellishment that's going to go off the side of the brown cardstock block there, but I can also add a little bit more detail to these with the stamps again. So I can emphasize the color by choosing either the light or the dark brown and keep all of the tones here just to that part of the color scheme. It's almost like I'm taking off the bottom two and just looking at the top of the color scheme instead of the green here, because the green then is going to become just this little shot that just appears in small elements rather than all the way through the whole page. You can start to see some of these stamped elements repeat, so that filigree that's up here in green reappears down here in brown. And I've also used just partial word stamps, so instead of the whole phrase of always face the sun, I have just the always there, and a little arrow set to bring your attention back into the photos. From there, I also want to add a little bit of the mist in the pink and brown to gather some similarity between this grouping of stamps and this grouping down here. I don't want to overdo it since I've already misted these 3 squares, but just adding a little bit can help quite a lot. Just a little sprinkle in both sections so that I have some that's going to go onto the background paper as well as the 3 little squares. Rectangles, really. And same thing with the brown. Using it quite sparingly, just enough to make sure that color is represented and brings that little bit of unity to the 2 different sections. Here's a little look at how things then come along once I've added a few more elements to the page. So I've repeated that idea over here with the other watercolored, misted, and stamped pieces. Then my letter stickers to form the title, and the journaling is just the names of the different people in these particular portraits. So, and in this case, I'm still using that same Funky Dory Craft in Gold Thickers alphabet, but I am starting to run out of some of the lowercase vowels. So using all capital letters to do the whole word gives me a little bit more freedom there, and so I replicated that same all caps idea with the smaller Jelly Bean letter stickers as well. That's the older font. There's 2 different fonts in the Jelly Bean letter stickers, so I'm using both different fonts. And now I want to go back to my color scheme and look at how things are setting up and what colors are and are not represented. So just as a little reminder, there's where I started, and I have just that little bit of the dark brown in the cardstock and then in the bit of stamping, and quite a lot of the medium brown because I have this craft toned pattern paper and a craft tone to the lettering here, and some light brown in the stamping as well. I have multiple shades of pink because I brought in that medium tone pink in the pattern paper here, and I have both a darker and a lighter pink in the mist painting here and the lighter pink in the stamping. But I only have the green around the very edge. Now I don't want to add a lot of green to the layout because just like the dark brown, the high contrast color creates a lot of impact without a lot of volume of the page. So if you look at the photo that's as an example, there's a lot more space taken up with the pink than there is with this little bit of green around the leaves of the flower. So I don't want to go too heavy-handed on the green. I just want to bring in a little bit. So I also wanted to bring in the heart motifs that I'm using throughout this album. And I wanted to go ahead and include my heart punch because I want to mix this heart punch shape, which is a Martha Stewart heart punch, with the shapes that are a little bit more whimsical that I'm using from the dies. So I decided, since I've been using the dies in the last few layouts, I'll use the punch this time, and I went to a green that matches that same green I've used around the edge, but it's not as intense in the green here because there's more of the background white creamy color than there is of the green. So you're just getting a little bit of the green, not a lot. And then I can add these hearts into the embellishment here, and that will help bring in this this type of embellishment and make it belong to the page a little bit more, so it doesn't feel that it's too much of a departure from the cleanness of these pattern papers and the solid cardstock. Now they have another element that brings them together and brings all of this central piece together with the outside frame. Now, a lot of people refer to the idea of measuring how much color you're using to things that are known as the gallon-quart pint combination or measurement or ratio or things like that, where you're looking at there should be a lot of one color and then have that for the next color and then half again for the next color, and so that you're always taking it down by about half. There should be twice as much of the light pink as whatever color it is less prevalent in your color scheme, right? So in this case, there's very little green, there's very little of the dark brown, and then from then on, the idea of doubling it. Now, I don't think this is a rule that you have to follow really strictly, and I don't tend to think of it too mathematically. Just like I don't tend to measure my papers, I don't tend to measure the amount of each color. But it is a handy guideline to keep in mind, just to give yourself a little bit of direction when you've chosen your color scheme and are wondering where things should go or how much of which thing to use. It is useful to think of which color do you want to have the most space on the page versus which one do you want to be a more saturated but less prevalent color, so that where there's actually very little of the page that's consumed by the green in this particular layout, the green actually does pack quite a lot of punch because you're seeing it in this concentrated color of green as a frame, and then you're seeing it in these 6 repeating accents along the way. I'm going to add just a tiny little bit of finish to this page with some of the gold sequins. Here's the part where I like to take my color scheme and make a transition from the color scheme to the feel of my overall album. So throughout this album, I'm using gold touches to bring together the whole design, and there are all different things that I'm repeating those heart shapes, repeating obviously the color scheme, but also some of the stamps and things like the baker's twine and some gold sequins. So these are going to be my last 2 touches to this layout, and the gold doesn't come into play on the color scheme at all, but it's something that I wanted to add throughout the book that will bring everything together. And one thing that I feel when you look at this page as it is right now is that there are lots of lovely little details, but there's nothing that gives me a nice little change in texture from everything that's paper. And there's nothing that gives me that little sparkle that kind of catches your eye and makes something a little bit more formal and dressy like a wedding. So by taking just a few sequins and dropping them across the page in a loose line, it will give me a way to direct your eye and dress it up with a little bit of sparkle throughout the page. So loose line of embellishments is something that I covered a lot in the 4x6 Photo Love class. Well, I should say that mild-mannered scrapbooker Shamel Lane covered in the 4x6 Photo Love class. And you can go back and have a look at that anytime. It's available in the archives at 2 Peas in a Bucket, but it's the very first lesson, the one on one photo, that talks about a loose line of embellishments and how you can use it to direct your eye across the page on a diagonal. And in that particular example, it's with a single photo layout, but it can definitely work with other types of composition. So I'm just looking for the right place here for these sequins in the middle, and I might actually layer them up here. On top of that little heart. Maybe one can go in this gap here, or possibly over here. I could move it over to this heart. There. So I'll glue those little sequins down into the right spot, and then I also want to include some of this baker's twine that I've used throughout the album so far. And I can do a few different things like that. I'm normally looking for a horizontal element, so I could go all the way across the page underneath the title, or just partially across the page under the title. I don't want to use staples on this baker's twine because my staples on my tiny attacher are silver and I'm using gold accents, and I don't want to take away from that. So I'd rather do ways that I can tuck the ends under or knot it on top. I could go all the way across the bottom of the page, but what I think I'd like to do is go around just the photos not the whole mat, but just the pictures, and put it quite near the bottom of the picture so that the twine's not going over her dress, it's just going along the concrete that they're standing on. And then tie it in a little bow. And then you can make a decision when you have an element like this of where you want the bow to go, because I have the choice here of bringing the bow over to the side that already has more stuff and keeping it on the diagonal for the loose line of embellishment that I'm creating with those sequins. Or if you feel that your page as you have it set up is a little bit unbalanced and it needs something on the other side, then you can pull the twine to the other side and tie the bow on the side that's away from the embellishment to give a little bit of balance. In this case, I think I'm going to bring the bow and keep it quite small, but bring it over to the side where the embellishment already exists, because I don't have anything over in this corner that I want to pull your eye to. But if there were something else over here, like you'd included the date or the journaling over here, or if part of the photo that was really important was in this particular corner, then I would suggest creating that balance by tying the bow on the other side. Here's my finished project for today, and your challenge is to use a color scheme to create your next layout. You can go to a site like Design Seeds or any other website that has color schemes like this, or you could use paint chips or the colors on your computer screen to create your own little box of different colors that you're going to use as your scheme, and then take that to your stash to figure out what supplies you're going to use. Remember, you don't have to find a pattern paper that has all of those colors in it. None of these pattern papers are multiple color. They're all just one color and white or cream, and that made things really easy to follow my own color scheme. If you can't find a paper that matches all the different elements in your color scheme, look to your other supplies like ink and mist and see if you can find something that will give you the right color tone to complete your layout. Then when you upload your page, and it can be on any topic, it does not need to be a wedding layout. When you upload your page to the gallery, make sure you share with us in the description underneath your layout how you went from that color scheme to your finished page, and give us any tips that you stumbled upon along the way. Be sure to share your inspiration piece so we can see the difference between your color scheme and your finished layout and get a little inkling into your creative process. Thanks so much for watching. See you soon.
Join us next week for the continuing adventures of Glitter Girl and the ongoing mystery of the scrapbooker behind the mask at twopeasinabucket.com.